There we go. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Confucius Institute Chinese Corner. We are very, very happy today to be joined by a special guest speaker, Dr. Lauren Walden. Welcome.
Welcome, thank you.
So just before we get in, a little bit again of the housekeeping for today. So this session will be recorded and shared at a later date. Lauren will be giving a 40-minute-ish talk and will be responding to questions after which. However, feel free to write your comments, responses, or questions in the chat so that we can get to them later on. And we would also be very, very happy to hear your responses or comments on what is said, and that we'd love to see that how this is responded to. And before we get into that, I would like to just have a brief introduction for the Confucius Institute as a whole to see who we are and why we are doing these things. So the Confucius Institute at Coventry University, we are part of a non-profit organization in China, and our mission is to share and promote Chinese language and culture across the West Midlands. That is our area of remit. The main way we do that is we run Mandarin classes for students of all abilities. And I know this is one of the main reasons we know Lauren, whose Chinese is excellent. And it is certainly better than mine. And we also offer cultural experiences and classes for local schools, local businesses. So if there's anything that you are interested in learning about us, or you would like to have any inquiries, if there are cultural issues, sensitivities, or topics you would love to discuss or learn more about, please get in touch with us at the email on the screen, which is confuciusinstitute@coventry.ac.uk. And feel free to follow us, comment, get in touch through our Twitter, Instagram, and Facebooks, which are all at Confucius Cov Uni. Thank you for your patience. So, Lauren, I'm going to pass this over to you. So when you are ready, please feel free to share your screen.
Will do.
And we can get started. So I'm personally looking forward to this. I've got myself ready, based here in Shanghai, ready to go. This is obviously the new Shanghai. There we go. So.
Thank you for filling in on that awkward moment where I'm trying to figure out the logistics. Well, thank you so much, George, for your kind introduction to the Confucius Institute at Coventry. Just a couple of words about myself. My name is Dr. Lauren Walden. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in contemporary Chinese art at Birmingham City University. I was a former PhD student at Coventry University. That's when I first came into contact with the Confucius Institute. I remain a student there, studying towards HSK 6, which I have been for numerous years now. I use Chinese to conduct archival research. My previous research focused on surrealism in Shanghai, and I'm continuing to look at the city in both the modern and contemporary eras in my work. And this talk today focuses on photography due to its indexical relation to the real. Therefore, I think it's an appropriate lens through which to look at the lives of the daily existence of ordinary people amidst a capitalist and imperialist backdrop. So I actually wanted to start today with a photo montage. So a photo montage obviously disrupts photography's relationship to reality. The image I'm showing you here was taken just before the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War in 1937 from a satirical journal called Modern Sketch or Shedai Manhua, manhua coming from the Japanese transliteration of manga. So what we can see in this image is the Shanghai racetrack, which was built by the British, who were the dominant force in the international concession. But what we can see here are straw huts, and they're satirically pasted onto this imperial setting to demonstrate the social inequality that pervaded Shanghainese urban existence. So straw huts were a common form of temporary housing for migrants who came to Shanghai in search of a better life. Obviously, this is spatially inaccurate. The straw huts were not literally next to the Shanghai racetrack or, at the very side of the Shanghai racetrack, but nevertheless, what I would argue is that this portends to a more believable social reality than the images of a capitalist modernity that adorned the popular pictorials of the modern era. So what I'm going to use the phrase Republican era throughout the talk. So for those of you who are not aware, the Republican era refers to 1911 to 1949, after the dissolution of the monarchy and the Qing dynasty, but before Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party came to power. So this is a really typical spread from one of the popular pictorial magazines of the time called Liang You Hua Bao. So by the time of about 1935, this reached a sort of circulation of about 50,000 copies a week, and it was the most popular pictorial of the era. So, I don't have time to do a sort of in-depth analysis of this photographic collage, but, needless to say, the signifiers of a somewhat hedonistic lifestyle abound: gambling, stage shows, beer adverts. So this was very much the life that the Shanghainese elite and imperial regime, that people pertaining to imperial regimes would lead in Shanghai. But clearly, this sort of glossy varnish did not emulate the standard of living for the vast majority of Shanghainese. So what I want to argue through photography in this presentation is that it was the relentless continuum of urban poverty, as we can see in the previous slide, that proved decisive in stimulating a socialist consciousness amongst many photographers based in the city until its liberation in 1949. And post-1949, this paved the way for Communist Party photographers to document urban reconstruction in the 1950s. Just a point here that I may use the acronym automatically CCP, which means Chinese Communist Party, for those of you who are not aware. So Shanghai was viewed in the West by the term the Paris of the East, a very Orientalist way of viewing Shanghai. But what I actually want to show through photography is that a socialist counter-narrative was stirring even before the outbreak of war with Japan and the devastation it caused to the city in 1937. Then I want to go on to say that after the CCP gained power, so I am doing a sort of before and after, providing adequate housing owned by the state to urban workers formed a key priority in redressing the ills of the Republican era and ensuring the continued support of the masses. At this juncture, Shanghainese photographers were left in a difficult position. On the one hand, there existed the imperative to document urban reconstruction through the building of Soviet-inspired model workers' villages such as Saoyang, enabling the creation of new socialist spaces. On the other hand, workers were also housed in former bastions of imperialism, such as modernist villas in the French concession, so the Fazujie. The CCP could not afford to tear down these usable buildings and engage in reconstruction. So what do you do with the sort of remains of capitalism that belonged to a now annihilated regime in terms of ideology? Such colonial architecture would inevitably appear in photographs, and this provoked a nostalgic cultural memory of the Republican era, something that the Chinese Communist Party wished to avoid. So what I want to argue then is that the CCP strategy in Shanghai assumed a hybrid pragmatic form of urban reconstruction and urban reappropriation. Now, clearly, to save money, the Communist Party did not want to tear down usable buildings that, had an aesthetically pleasing value that were built by colonizers. But on the other hand, this posed a serious visual problem because of the ideology that was inherent in continuing the upkeep of these buildings and their appearance in numerous photographs. So in the visual sphere, I'm arguing that Shanghai became somewhat of a palimpsest. A palimpsest is a technical term which means a manuscript that's been erased out and rewritten over. It's a metaphor I often use that I think is quite useful in looking at the modern history of Shanghai. So the vestiges of Shanghai's capitalist past were seen to threaten the creation of a socialist modernity in the city. So the relationship to reality photography has always held proved highly problematic in terms of representing the new Shanghai, a socialist city which aimed to be purged of its former vice, hedonism, and inequality. So let's move on to some photographers now. I want to turn to the cases of Wu Inxian and Xia Fei, who documented the lives of impoverished people in Shanghai prior to the Sino-Japanese War. So, let's just contrast the capitalist representation of Shanghai with the daily life of ordinary citizens here. I am not coming at this from any form of ideological angle, other than to try to understand the causes behind why the Chinese Communist Party managed to gain power in 1949. And in terms of a continuum, the most constant cause of mass dissent was poverty, pure and simple. And I think that this is really starkly represented through the photography of Xia Fei. So these photographs were taken in 1936, 1 year prior to the Sino-Japanese War. And Xia Fei, after living in Shanghai, once war broke out, he actually became an official Chinese Communist Party photographer in Yan'an, the Communist Party's base during both the Sino-Japanese War and the ensuing Civil War. So when these photographers first arrived in Shanghai, actually, they were producing works that were more akin to this. They did experiment with, avant-garde techniques. Some even experimented with surrealism, which is something that I've previously studied. But just because of their empirical experience in the city and what they saw on a daily basis, that empirical experience imbued them with a socialist consciousness. So a scholar on poverty in Shanghai, Janet Chen, notes, by the beginning of the Nanjing decade, the notion that poverty constituted China's deepest malady was firmly embedded in intellectual discourse. And it was this continuum of an impoverished existence that led many to sympathize with the CCP, adhering to the Marxist theory that poverty existed due to the capitalist exploitation of working class labor. So bearing this in mind, in 1936, Xia Fei formulated what became known as the weapon theory of photography, 摄影武器论. Obviously today, to use photography for the purposes of social engagement is a really common thing, but it was very revolutionary at the time. Chinese artistic photography at the time was basically aligned to the guohua, or national painting genre. So all of those, the motifs of nature that you could find in national painting, you would also find in photography. So the feng hua xue yue, the wind, flowers, snow, and moon. So this is an absolutely complete departure, obviously, from that genre of photography. So this is how Xia Fei commented upon the weapon theory of photography. He stated, today, photography is one of the most powerful weapons for disseminating national calamities. At the time, the idea of weaponizing photography to raise awareness of social issues in China was in its infancy. But Xia Fei highlighted social issues through a focus on the human being. He documented here two types of transient dwelling that the urban poor were forced to inhabit in Shanghai. So we can see here riverboats and hutments. Diao notes, so these riverboats had a specific terminology. They were called sampans. Diao notes, Sampans were usually only 2 meters long and 1 meter wide. And in extreme cases, even 3 families lived separately in the front, middle, and rear holes. In this photograph, so we can see at the very top here, there's a policeman who compels a family to move their boat. And if we, adopt a methodology of visual analysis here, common methodology in art history, what we can see here is that Shanghai is invoking a compositional hierarchy. So the policeman is situated above the migrants to reflect that, sort of feudal hierarchy here. This is further accentuated by the diagonal lines of hay bales being carried. The policeman's nonchalant stance gestures towards ambivalence, whilst a dejected lady stares towards the ground, towards the centre right of the photograph, engendering an emotional binary between oppressor and oppressed. In stark contrast to the enforced movement of migrants, Shanghai's work, A Miserable Life, on the right-hand side here, symbolizes stasis. So here we can see an old man languishing in a hutment supported by a tree, which suggests that this has become a long-term dwelling, again, epitomizing this relentless continuum of urban poverty. So these purportedly transient dwellings were actually long-term dwellings for migrant workers who came to Shanghai in search of a sustainable existence. So now moving on to a contemporary of Shanghai, Wu Inxian. He also wrote on photographic theory, and during the Sino-Japanese War would also go to Yan'an, the CCP's base, to become an official Communist Party photographer. He wrote a piece in 1936 published by Shenbao, which was a really popular, actually the most popular newspaper at the time, entitled Appreciating Art Photography. So here he charts the metamorphosis of the medium from individual portraiture to the expression of collective phenomena. He argues for a hybrid appraisal of art, not documentary photography. So these two images that you can see here, Wu Inxian believed that this was artistic photography. So he's not denying that photography is a composition. He's not denying that he's using shadow to exaggerate things and frame things in a certain way. He's aware that there is a propagandistic element to what he's doing here. And he's not trying to frame these photographs as pure, unadulterated documents. But what he states is the following. He believed that social value and aesthetic qualities should sit side by side, basically. And he states, with regards to fine art photography, we should combine its social value and artistic value when making a critique. If a photograph is newsworthy, an assassination, the scene of a train collision, a volcanic eruption, flooding, then the work was obtained by the photographer by almost sacrificing their life. This is certainly something that contains social value. So I think that photography's social value certainly comes to the fore in Wu Inxian's Shanghai repertoire. Hard labor is a recurrent theme. Social value residing in visualizing the plight of the impoverished. This is achieved, however, in a highly individual, stylized manner. So on the left-hand side, you can see the work entitled Under Heavy Burden. So Wu adds the following description beneath this photograph. He states, the porters strode hard, carrying heavy sacks towards a foreign ship in the distance. Note foreign ship here for social context. This is the other side to this 10 miles of luxury. So there was a 4-character idiom used to describe Shanghai during the Republican era, which was surely Yangchang, 10 miles of luxury. This silhouetted ship we can see here is, you can probably barely make it out actually, is deliberately blurred in soft focus in order to emphasize the distance from the workers. The downtrodden posture of the workers, engulfed by shadow, enhances the effect of the physical burden they are carrying. So note my point about this being residing within the realm of art photography and not documentary photography. So moreover, the photograph on the right-hand side here, a thought-provoking sight outside a plush villa, carries a deliberately provocative title. Similarly to the previous photograph, this ordinary Chinese man is weighed down by heavy goods, which he is clearly struggling to lift. The composition emphasizes a diagonal tilt in the worker's posture. We don't see the villa itself, only the hard work used to keep it afloat. This omission turns the table on invisible subjects, such as workers who were left out of photography celebrating Shanghai's imperialist modernity. The villa, as a symbol of wealth and prosperity, is instead consigned to our imaginations, whilst arduous labour is rendered visible instead of being swept under the carpet. So, what happened to socialist photography in Shanghai once the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1937? Well, as I stated before, both Wu Inxian and Xia Fei left Shanghai to work for the CCP formally in Yan'an. But this didn't mean that socialist forms of photography ended in the city. So during the Sino-Japanese War, the CCP clandestinely infiltrated refugee camps in Shanghai, gaining traction amongst oppressed peoples forced to reside there. Clearly, operating in a clandestine capacity meant that CCP photographers could not themselves be active, but actually photography of other parties spoke for itself. Important to note that the imperial powers during the Sino-Japanese War did a lot to help Chinese refugees, particularly in the French concession, where a Christian Jesuit priest named Father Jacquinot created a safe zone in the city where the Japanese, he negotiated with the Japanese not to bomb or attack that area, saving the lives of hundreds of thousands of Chinese people. So I can't say that this photography is ideologically socialist, but I think it's certainly socially engaged. And this is an anonymous photograph, but certainly due to the source is from a French photographer or someone who resided in the French concession anyway. So this example of a refugee camp in the French concession renders the imaginary photo montage I displayed at the beginning a spatial reality. Abject poverty in the shadow of a plush villa, to paraphrase Wu Inxian. And just for context as well, so the richest inhabitants of Shanghai tended to live in the French concession where there were garden-lined streets and European-style villas. So again, we can see that really stark contrast, and that's made possible through the photographic juxtaposition here, the villa sort of incongruously lying in the background whilst we see images of highly impoverished people in the foreground. So I'll just move on to the next slide. Ultimately, the fact that the CCP could enter Shanghai without any resistance, basically, in 1949, was the product of years of urban poverty, both before and during the Sino-Japanese War. And this reached further extremes in the Civil War due to the hyperinflation of currency. So this is a shot taken during Chinese Civil War from 1945 to 1949, when the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party were at odds with each other. Photography, this is, by the way, I should mention, this is actually the son of Liu Xun, Zhou Haiying, whose name literally means, I think, child of Shanghai. So what I think that Zhou Haiying is trying to do here is disseminate the reality of poverty to the public at large, making the Lao Baixing, or ordinary people, receptive to the promises of social equality proposed by the CCP. Interestingly, the CCP funded Zhou Haiying, and he, if I remember correctly, he even went on a trip to Hong Kong to buy a camera funded by the CCP. So amidst civil war, Zhou Haiying appears to document Shanghai as a city in stasis. So the nature of these photographs is no different to what I showed you basically over 10 years earlier. So there was a fatigue, a sort of fatigue of incessant poverty, basically. So this is his displaced peoples series here, and I've just taken 2 shots, but I think there's about 10 shots in this series here. And I think that it provides a compelling counter-narrative to the oft-cited notion that Shanghai simply lay dormant during the Maoist eras. So after the founding of the People's Republic of China by the Communist Party in 1949, a lot of foreigners were expelled, and obviously on the Western side, a British newspaper, The Times, actually referred to Shanghai under Mao as a dying city. Time magazine, the US magazine, referred to Shanghai as a city in paralysis. But, you know, this begs the question, well, couldn't we use the same terminology to apply to Shanghai during the Republican era to describe the plight of the vast majority of people inhabiting that city? So in the Republican era, for a typical Chinese man, was Shanghai not a dying city? Was Shanghai not a scene of paralysis, as it were, as photographs show? So moving on to what is known as the liberation by the CCP in 1949. The French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson shows this is depicting this huge victory parade which strode through the city. So foreign photographers tend to crop up in China during historical pivot points. Henri Cartier-Bresson was on a commission from Magnum Photographs, so probably in terms of photojournalism, the largest agency in the world at the time. So, you know, the foreign photographers were depicting this sort of constant change rather than documenting the ardor of everyday existence. So we can see here a parade, and obviously that's demonstrative of mass sentiment, but it's an ephemeral act. It's something short-lived. Ultimately, the communists had to confront the aesthetic legacy of imperialism embodied by permanent structures in Shanghai and in the form of foreign concessions, particularly in the form of foreign concessions. So as Wasserstrom notes, tearing down signature buildings was an obvious but costly option. A more appealing alternative was to alter these structures in symbolically meaningful ways, and then celebrate these transformations as indicative of a dark past left behind for a brighter future. Now, after the liberation, Shanghai was not viewed by the Chinese Communist Party in a positive light. So a weekly called Jingji Zhoubao, Economic Weekly, noted in 1949, Shanghai is a non-productive city. It is a parasitic city. It is a criminal city. It is a refugee city. It is the paradise of adventurers. In a word, Shanghai is a city where consumption is greater than production. Indeed, one may even say a city where waste is greater than consumption. So how did the CCP deal with these spatial contradictions of the Shanghai cityscape, with the sort of legacy of all of these imperial buildings? Well, we can draw from Henri Lefebvre's The Production of Space. So Lefebvre notes, when a new power arrives in a city, it will of necessity permeate the city with a new spatial form. But already existing spatial forms will not inevitably fade away. So the CCP had to sort of do 2 things here. On the one hand, they wanted to build these centerpieces to symbolize the transference of power and the inauguration of a new regime. But on the other hand, they had to appropriate formerly imperial spaces to conform with their new socialist ideology. So I want to contrast 2 case studies of urban reconstruction in Shanghai, beginning with the iconic development of the People's Avenue Park and Square. Now, this replaced the very first photograph I showed you. So it replaced the race course that was built by the British. And so obviously this is a highly symbolic gesture as to why the People's Avenue and Park were built on that very site. So it was rightly viewed, the People's Park Avenue and Square, as a centerpiece of post-war urban reconstruction in Shanghai. Sun and Smith draw attention to the highly symbolic nature of racecourse demolition. A former imperial site founded by British merchants, Chinese people were barred from entering here until 1908. They comment, with the People's Avenue at its heart and People's Square and People's Park on either side, this new complex of public space was meant to physicalize the transformation of old society, marked by imperialist oppression, into a new society built by and for ordinary Shanghainese. So the photograph on the left here is a photograph from the Shanghai Archives website. I was supposed to go there in person, but then of course COVID happened. So I scoured their website instead. What's important here is not only the focus on the scale of the reconstruction, but also on the physical labor of ordinary people in the foreground who are literally paving the People's Avenue stone by stone. Now, once the square was finally built, it was scarcely photographed empty. So if we move to the right-hand side photograph here, we can see a mass celebration. And this was to welcome the Indonesian president who gave an anti-colonial speech at the time. What I think, though, that both these photographs are doing is situating the individual, the subjectivity of the individual, within a much wider collective undertaking. This interpolates the viewer, who was likely not to have been involved, to feel a part of the event. So this is evidenced by the children standing on the balcony and looking out onto the masses. So the point of that photograph is to put yourself in the position of the children visually and look out onto the, thronging masses of people who are listening to a speech by the Indonesian president. So mass campaigns, rallies, gatherings, celebrations convened in the People's Square were, however, ephemeral, short-lived events. The purposing of space would, of course, change with the political campaigns of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that whilst these scenes of thronging masses are visually compelling in terms of scale and linear perspective, I would argue that the photography that I'm going to show you now of Shaoyang Model Village was shot with greater intimacy, affording a sense of attainability to the viewers. So one of my sort of arguments that I'm thinking about in this, hopefully turn this into an article someday, is that actually compared to mass campaigns and rallies, the fact of an individual person having their own house was a much more successful piece of Communist Party propaganda. So, a lot of research is currently talking about the sort of mass sentiment that was engendered by these campaigns and large gatherings. But actually, I feel that what people who, were formerly impoverished really wanted was quite simply their own place to live. And that's why I think propaganda surrounding Shaoyang Model Village was so successful. So we can see here that these photographs are shot with much greater intimacy, and they afford a sense of attainability to the viewer, unlike the photographs here. So Shaoyang Model Village was heavily inspired by Soviet architecture and opened to residents in 1952. It's useful to also cite Henri Lefebvre here. So Lefebvre held that a society undergoing socialist transformation, including during the transition period, could not simply take as a given space produced under capitalism. To do so would be no different from taking on capitalist political and social structures, which would lead to a dead end for the revolution. In other words, occupying former imperialist buildings alone would not create the ideal ideological conditions for the CCP to transform the city of Shanghai. So this is a thread from Renmin Rebao, the People's Daily, photographed by Yu Chuangshou. It was actually also published in Jiefang Rebao, which was a Shanghai-specific newspaper. So what I think is going on here is that Yu Chuangshou's photographs convey what I'm terming a humanized uniformity. So it gestures towards individual emancipation in a material sense, someone having their own space to live, And if we think back to, there were shared facilities in Saoyang, which was obviously a part of socialist ideology. So people shared kitchens and a lot of communal spaces. But I would argue that a lot has been written about that. But I mean, personally, would you rather live there or in a cramped sampan where there was no communal space whatsoever? Even, you know, there was no space to live, really. So yeah, I just thought I'd mention that by way of comparison. So Saoyang, these photographs gesture towards both individual emancipation in a material sense and collective belonging in a spiritual one, or should I say politico-spiritual, because obviously the communists, well, Mao at the time was suppressing religion quite fervently. Yu Chuangshou's protagonists are a young couple with a newborn baby. Now, one of the ironies of these photographs taken in the model workers' village is quite simple and pointed out by Lu Pan. All depict a relaxing and amiable atmosphere of everyday leisure. So, although this is a model workers' village, there's no work being depicted in these photographs, basically. The arduous of labour are quite absent, despite the fact that the communists clearly hoped that improving living conditions would inextricably be linked to an increase in productivity. So the statistics actually bear these out in real life. So my apologies, I quit maths as soon as was humanly possible. So forgive me if I make any mistakes on this front. So in the year 1958, Shanghai's gross industrial output value had reached over 17 billion RMB, which was an increase of 553.5% over 1949. Additional output from this year alone was greater than the total output of 1949. Shanghai steel production had reached 1,220,000 tons compared to 5,000 tons in 1949. Heavy industry overall had not increased by a mere 100 or 200%, but it increased 1,853% over 1949. Even textile production, which before liberation comprised half of the total industrial output, had increased to 200%. Phew, I'm glad I got that out of the way, but you know, this is obviously really important. So despite these depictions of model workers' villages as places of leisure, you know, the Communist Party expected in return huge increases in industrial output. A little bit off topic as well, but post-1958, what was called the Great Leap Forward, or Da Yue Jin, happened, where Mao wanted production to increase to such an extent that, you know, people were working overnight. People didn't, and in the countryside, didn't have enough, you know, food to live on, and people in the countryside were feeding the urban workers who were contributing to growing industrial output. Mao eventually wanted industrial output to overtake that of the UK and the Soviet Union, whom he, having had an alliance with, had split from. So there's a lot going on behind these statistics that clearly isn't represented in this propaganda photography. So visually speaking then, in terms of propaganda, the Communist Party had to move from depictions of labour being oppressive to emancipatory to ensure continued increases in production. So Saoyang was exclusively inhabited by factory workers. And in this following photograph, also by Yu Chuangshou, he depicts a Shanghainese female textile factory worker firmly in control of her machine. The posture of the worker is upright, a stark contrast to the contorted bodies of Wu Inxian, burdened by their heavy loads. So we can obviously see here, and quite rightly, this move from manual labor to machinization, right? So machinization was synonymous with the corporeal emancipation of the workers. They all, by proxy, became managers of these entities. So the worker here is really endowed with agency. She's completely in control of this humongous machine. And again, from a visual perspective, I am an art historian, and we can see the convergence of threads here. And this is creating what's called an off-center vanishing point, which I just learned in Chinese is 消失点. in the visual composition of the photograph. So we're directing our gaze towards the worker themselves because all the threads are converging on the worker. So I would actually call this a piece of art photography again, rather than a piece of documentary photography. I think the slippage from the Republican era continues very much into the People's Republic. Now I want to contrast urban reconstruction with urban reappropriation, and this is my last section before we can go to some Q&A. So Mark Frazier notes the vast array of imperialist buildings appropriated into socialist spaces by the CCP after Shanghai's liberation in 1949. The Workers' Cultural Palace was placed in the former Oriental Hotel, the Youth Palace in the Great World Entertainment Center, the Municipal Library in the Racecourse Clubhouse, and the Shanghai Museum in the Zhonghui Bank Building. French concession villas and apartment blocks were also used to house workers, enacting Mao Zedong's statement that peasants will live in skyscrapers. So I wanted to look at the case study of the Workers' Cultural Palace, which was the former Oriental Hotel, which obviously the most wealthy would stay in during the Republican era. I think it ties in well with depictions of Shaoyang Model Village. So again, there's a recurring theme here of depicting workers at leisure rather than engaged in manual labor. The inaugural plaque was written by the new mayor of Shanghai, Chen Yi, and reads, "A school and a paradise for workers." This photograph documents a swathe of workers definitively occupying a formerly foreign-owned space. So according to Hu Jirong in his book on the Shanghai Workers' Cultural Palace, the original appearance of the building is constantly occupied by new proletarian discourse representations, marking the debut of a new urban subject and the establishment of a new discourse of urban leadership, with the working class as the main protagonist. Second, with the guidance of national ideology, workers obtained the spiritual and cultural satisfaction of turning themselves into masters through production in the workers' official cultural space. That is, via specific cultural entertainment activities, thus forming a common class subject consciousness and emotional structure of an era. In this sense, the Workers' Cultural Palace is also a spiritual space for producing the subjectivity of the working class. So photography of the Workers' Cultural Palace provides a new discourse of socialist culture occupying former imperialist spaces. Cultural occupation of a space was actually seen by the CCP to be just as effective as the building of a new space, which was a priori socialist in its structure. So we can see in the first photograph on the left-hand side here, the orderly lines of modestly dressed workers entering the palace with a revolutionary poster captured in the background. A giant poster of Mao equally adorned the external walls of the palace. So the Workers' Palace, in line with Communist Party cultural policy, created a photo book of workers' photography in 1958, heralding a new generation of socialist photographers based in Shanghai, taking the helm from Wu Inqian and Xia Fei. So in the preface to the work, the following statement vis-a-vis photography's contribution to socialism is stated. Photography is a powerful propaganda tool for trade union activities, as well as an art appreciation activity. After the liberation, following an improvement in the living standards of workers, some bought cameras to capture background scenes and new expressions of everyday life during the holidays and outings, printed and pasted them into books, and circulated them to each other, improving their ability of art appreciation. Photography is a hotbed for expressing the good life of socialism. So this is a couple of examples of the photographs that workers took after being tutored in photography at the Workers' Cultural Palace. So I think that these photographs do have a certain element of subjectivity, but obviously they conform to Mao's infamous statement in Yan'an on arts and culture in 1942, whereby art had to be employed in the service of politics. So again, there's a mix of labor and leisure here. A focus on leisure, I believe, meant that socialism was seen to embody every aspect of an individual's existence. and wasn't confined to one's duties in the workplace. It was imbricated in both the domestic and the recreational spheres. So actually this photograph on the left, called the ha-ha-jing, like, you know, one of those mirrors that distorts your shape. These were actually banned, by the way, during the Cultural Revolution, just for your information. It actually recalls modernist tropes of the mirror image, which were designed to reflect one's own subjectivity and individuality. But both workers, the father and the daughter, can clearly be identified as workers due to their attire. So what we can see here is that all recreation is encoded and occurring within a newly inaugurated socialist space. For Lefebvre, everyday life was socialism's revolutionary background, and seemingly flippant photographs such as the ha-ha-jing or the distorting mirrors reiterate sanctioned behavior to the masses. So you could go to an amusement arcade under, you know, before the Cultural Revolution. That by seeing this photograph, you know, that's a sort of proxy for being allowed to do something. It's a sanctioned behavior. So Xiaobo Su puts it, for a new socialist China, a new space correspondingly should be created to accommodate the regime and show a radical break from the previous feudal society. Lived space, which embodies people's actual experience of production and consumption in everyday life, became the immediate object for the CCP to reshape. The other photograph, and the final photograph from the workers' collection I've chosen, is a steam turbine. So again, we can see this contrast with Wu Inxian's photographs. This is machinization occurring again. Workers are endowed with agency here. The angle at which the photograph is shot is able to both capture the greater spatial expanse of the factory, but also create an element of subjectivity on the part of the workers, emphasizing their individual contribution. So ultimately, the role of the Workers' Cultural Palace in Shanghai was to enforce ideology by endowing workers with a cultural capital that would have been unthinkable during the Republican era. So to conclude then, I think that Shanghai has actually been falsely labelled a dying city during the Maoist era following the establishment of the People's Republic of China. The cultural memory of Shanghai during the Republican era is usually that of the Paris of the East. However, Janet Chen counters, and I quote, "On its facade, Shanghai resembles a prosperous heaven, yet its backside is in fact the deepest hell." I think that this was particularly true for migrant workers who experienced a sustained degradation in living standards as they were hit by 2 consecutive wars. On an empirical level, after the liberation, Shanghai's population grew by 44%, from approximately 5 million in 1949 to 7.2 million in 1947. Becoming the industrial center of China. The standard of living clearly improved for many under the aegis of the Chinese Communist Party, but this was all undertaken within a highly regulated framework where the camera lens focused on the all-encompassing socialist existence of the worker, their domicile, their working life, leisure pursuits, and political spiritual beliefs. Post-war urban reconstruction in Shanghai was not just limited to buildings, indeed imperialist structures still stood, but rather infiltrated the individual psyche of the human beings that inhabited the buildings. A new socialist subject was represented via the agency of the photographic lens. Indeed, the new Shanghai was contingent upon the ideological reconstruction of the new worker. So as a 2009 retrospective spread on Saoyang Model Village in Liberation Daily reads, "Xin Sun Xin Ren, new village, new people." So that's all I've got today. Thanks so much. Stop the share.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That was very interesting, fascinating, and I think we hopefully, I certainly enjoyed it, and I hope our audience did. And we have a few minutes left for some questions. So if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A or directly into the chat. We'll get to them. So there's a question. We'll start from the first question here is from Yang Yingjun, who is the Chinese Director of Confucius Institute at De Montfort University. So welcome.
Hello.
And the question is, how would you compare or contrast Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor in the early 1860s with the Shanghai Poor in the 1930s and 1940s? Or would that be compatible?
Wow. Although I am British, I am not an expert at all in British history, unfortunately. But it's a fascinating question, and I really enjoy the comparative aspect of your question. I think that in terms of the Shanghai Poor in the 1930s and 1940s, what you've got to remember is the causality of that in comparison to the causality of the London Labour and London Poor. Obviously, part of a capitalist society before the creation of the welfare state in the UK meant that there was not only exploitation of foreign labour in the colonies, but also of the working class of Britain as well. So they're comparable in the sense of there not being a welfare state, basically, to answer that question in a sort of slightly British context. But I would readily admit that is outside my area of expertise.
Well, thank you very much for that question. I think it might be interesting also to look at that from, as you say, from the viewpoint as from yourself, from as you say, from photographic, excuse me, I can barely speak today, a photographic and propagandist. So how are the press approaching both sides from this way? And I think that was interesting, fascinating. Thank you very much. And the next question is I think a quick one from Quinn. Thank you. She says, around the 20-minute mark, you mentioned a French priest who negotiated a ceasefire with the Japanese, and she forgets the name. Could you recommend any literature where you could learn more about this?
Yes, indeed. So let me type the name to you. It's Father Jacquinot.
Okay.
Yes, and there is actually a monograph on Father Jacquinot that's been written by, I think she's called Marcia Ristiano. So there is a full monograph documenting his whole life and his priesthood in Shanghai, where he created a refugee area, having negotiated with the Japanese. And this model actually was replicated in Nanjing, where the Chinese, affected a horrific massacre. So I'll just send you the name, but the biography is by Marcia Ristiano.
Okay, thank you. I hope that thing's I think maybe mistake the Nanjing massacre was, I believe, the Japanese against the Chinese. I think I misheard you to say.
Oh, sorry.
So, but yeah, no, thank you. That was a great question. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to throw them. We've got quite a bit of things coming up. Seeing something in the chat. So Susan, thank you. Are there any more photographs available online to look at? So that was a good question. If you're interested in learning more generally, perhaps where would someone go?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Susan. So I've actually been using a Chinese database called Duxio, but that does require a subscription. There's a great website called everydaylifeinmaoistchina.org that's run by Colville Meskins. And I think he's a professor in the US, and he basically collates photographs of everyday life in Maoist China from 1949 to 1976. So in terms of that period, that would be a great place to look. In terms of the Republican era, there's the North China Daily Herald as well, if you want to get the perspective from a British perspective or from a French perspective. There's Le Journal de Shanghai, that covered events in the French concession, both of which are full of photographs. So should I type in everyday life in maoistchina.org?
Thank you for that. I'm sure we'll be able to, we might share when we put this up onto the website. I'll try and put in a couple of these links as well. So that's fascinating. Please follow through with other questions. I mean, I found it fascinating personally when we're looking at the presentation of the photography, because again, photography is not an area that I know much about. It's and the composition. And one of the things that I've written in my notes that I was taking notes is when at the beginning when we were very much talking about the composition of the photograph. So we see that composition of the, you said at the beginning with the police officer at the top, and then you talked a little bit about the workers who were blurred and coming through this. And my question is again, because I think there's how much of that is intentional on the side of the photographer, because of course this is not, the photographer doesn't have control over these sets. These are not set pieces. So I'm curious if you would you have some knowledge about this. Like
yeah, good point. They're not set pieces, but I actually don't believe in documentary photography as a genre. I believe that all photography is ultimately a composition, and that a photographer does have control over quite a lot of elements. You might not have control over the exact scene, but you do have control in the way that you shoot a scene. So if we take, for example, the refugee camp with the villa in the background, the photographer could have easily just focused on the refugees themselves without creating the juxtaposition of the villa in the background. So there's clearly some sort of socially engaged attempt there at demonstrating a comparison between the rich and the poor during the Sino-Japanese War. Similarly, for the Shanghai photograph, the migrants on the boat, there's a plethora of angles at which that photograph could have been taken. But yes, Shanghai did not have control over the policeman telling the migrants to move on, but he did have control over how he conveyed that. So yeah, a lot of my work actually focuses on disrupting this notion of documentary photography in general. Can a photograph ever just be a neutral document? I mean, I would argue no, it can't. So it's a really interesting point.
Yeah, no, yeah, thank you. It's the whole thing again is fascinating to see, and it's also interesting for myself to see some of the parallels from those days that are still around today. Especially when we look at the migrant workers and this tradition in China, in many cities around China today, we still see migrant workers next to very Haliburton. There's another question coming from Karine. Thank you very much. Will the slides recording be available at some point? And if so, where would I find this? I think I can answer this one. So, Karine, I will put the website into the chat just now. But we have a specific website where we share recordings of all of our Chinese talks, and I have actually written that into the chat towards the top at the beginning. It's confuciusinstitute.commentary.domains. Then I will put this in around here again. But we have all of this will be uploaded over the next couple of days. Probably might well try to get done this afternoon. But yes, everything will be put in. And I think that's a great place to actually come to an end. So we're getting a lot of thank you messages from everyone, and I'd like to add my thanks to that.
Question from
yes, one other question from Federica.
Yeah. Sure. Thanks, Freddie, for your question. If there is one between, wondering what the relationship is, if there is one between these documentary photographs and the propaganda posters of that age. Yeah, great question, Feddy. And thank you for your inverted commas around the words photography. Now, interestingly, Chinese propaganda posters in the early 50s start out, although they're clearly not representative of reality, they're very much based in the real world. Now, when it comes to the Great Leap Forward, you find that they're all of a sudden imbued with mythological symbols such as dragons and phoenixes that try to create an abundance of supposed wealth when actually people were suffering from abject famine. So it's just a question of scale, I think, as to how documentary something can be. I mean, the photography theorist Charles Peirce stated that photography has an indexical relationship to reality. There's a relationship to reality, but it'll never be real. And I think that the same can actually, we can apply the same to the the propaganda posters in terms of scale. They originally started out with motifs of socialist realism, so, you know, glorified portrayals of manual labor, but then they quickly, during the Great Leap Forward, descended into pure mythology, really. So that there's a very much a transition there.
Thank you. That's we often have these very good questions to just right at the very end when there's a short time. I'm sure there's a whole another talk that could be looked at comparing the development of propaganda posters and materials specifically. I think especially up to modern day, how these are still very much available. And again, going back to the earlier question of comparisons between, you know, different, you know, the UK and China, this would be there's a wealth of interesting areas that we could look at. Again, presentation of photography through our current media, through social, again, plenty of interesting things. But thank you so much for this fascinating talk today.
Thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate it, and all of your questions as well. And thank you to George for organising it. It's no mean feat to organise continuous activities during the pandemic. So thank you very much.
Welcome and congratulations. And I do want final thought just to remind, if people aren't aware of HSK, Lauren did say she was aiming at HSK 6. For those who aren't aware, that is the highest possible level of HSK at the moment. So when she says she's not going to Chinese, I do just want to finish off with an extra bit there. Thank you all so much. We are going to end it here.
Thanks everyone. Bye now. Bye.
Bye-bye.